Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game S. So today I got a fun and interesting episode for you guys this evening because we're going to be talking about the state of software emulation, both for retro gaming as well as modern games, how much is going to change in 2025 and how much has already changed in 2024, because we have had a metric crap ton of innovation in the software emulation sphere in the last 12 months. We've also had some negative effects from some lawsuits as well, so we're going to talk about just how good software emulation is getting, where it's going to be going in 2025, and how it's going to get there. Before we get too far involved though, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like and subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Definitely helps us out. And I know I talk a lot about real hardware on the channel. I also talk a lot about arcade boards and MiSTer FPGA and FPGA gaming devices in general. But I want you to know that I appreciate every single way to play a video game. If you want to use software emulation and spend $0, it's totally fine for me. So long as you're playing games and having fun, I am happy for you. The number one innovation I think we're going to see in 2025 though is more impressive PlayStation 4 emulation. That intro video from Persona 5, that was running on Shad PS4, and this is a demo that the Shad PS4 team put up of The Last Guardian running into their emulator. Now granted, it is not rendering everything correctly and it's only running between 5 to 7 frames per second, but we're not here to talk about the overall performance. We're here to talk about the fact that this can even happen in the first place. Sure, we have Nintendo Switch emulation, but that's definitely not the most powerful piece of hardware out there, and it is running on an NVIDIA Tegra chip, which is very well known. Something like Shad PS4 even being able to get in-game on something like The Last Guardian and showing you it rendering and playable on screen, although playable is definitely subjective here, is nothing short of impressive. You're going to see a lot in 2025 of quote-unquote current consoles being emulated and being emulated very well. Now obviously we're at the PlayStation 5 at this point in time, so PlayStation 4 is hard to call current gen, but it is so close honestly in graphical fidelity and complexity. It really feels like current generation to me. Or seeing something like Guilty Gear running in Shad PS4, even if again it isn't running perfect, is absolutely impressive work, because the PlayStation 4 is not a simple platform whatsoever, and you really are seeing software emulation catching up to a lot of current things, because for the longest time we've had emulators for Nintendo 64, Super Nintendo, Sega Dreamcast, all of those retro consoles you can think about. So now what is left? Of course, improving on software emulation from software emulators that already exist is going to be a very big deal in 2025, but so is hardware that you can't currently technically emulate, because for as much as Shad PS4 can do, it really doesn't bring games to a playable experience. And that is not a knock on the developers or their efforts whatsoever. I am highly impressed by what's going on here. It just means in the next 12 months you may end up in a situation where maybe there is a handful of PlayStation 4 games that are playing as good, if not better, than if they were playing on PlayStation 4, and that would be pretty awesome to see. Now moving back a few years, we're on to PlayStation 2, because just recently the LRPS2 core for RetroArch came out, basically rebuilding PlayStation 2 emulation in RetroArch from the ground up based on PCSX2, and for the longest time PCSX2 standalone was the emulator you wanted to use if you wanted to emulate PlayStation 2. So it's great to see more quote-unquote competitors come onto the scene and give retro gaming enthusiasts and software emulation enthusiasts different options, because that is really what I value when it comes to playing retro games and making sure that people can still have the same fun that they did 20 years ago. Options are good for everyone. Competing developments mean innovations, and you end up with a better product in the end, because honestly when I poll most people and ask how they play PlayStation 2, they tell me they do it in software emulation with enhancements, because you can get some PlayStation 2 games looking very close to a PlayStation 3 level of hardware. Something like Soul Calibur here running in 4K with pretty much every enhancement I can turn on looks absolutely stunning, and better than if you plugged a PlayStation 2 into a television, in my opinion. Leave me a comment down below, at least for PlayStation 2. Are you a real hardware player, or are you a software emulator? I would be curious to hear what the majority of you out there are using, because I like to poll the audience to see. Now in the worst news section of things, obviously in 2024 Nintendo went on an absolute tear with pretty much any lawsuit they could possibly imagine, and I covered each and every one of them on the channel, and I think they're going to continue to do the same thing in 2025, especially with Switch 2 coming out very soon. By the time you watch this video, maybe you at least have some concrete details from Nintendo, and they even showed up at CES to look at some cases from another company that said that they had seen a Switch 2. They sent lawyers there to check it out, but we've lost a ton of Nintendo Switch and Nintendo 3DS emulators in 2024, and I think you're going to see the same thing happen in 2025. And before you say they still exist, yes, they're kind of around the edges of things, but honestly it is not the full scale, full steam ahead software development on the Switch side of things that you saw earlier in 2024. Yuzu ended up going away, Ryujinx things ended up going away. Basically, the teams that were behind these software emulators that were running Nintendo Switch hardware and software better than Nintendo's hardware could run it itself have been basically disbanded. And the entrance of Tropic Haze, the makers of the Yuzu and Citra emulator, they ended up having to shut down both of those emulators and settling with Nintendo for $2.4 million. So I think, at least on the Nintendo side of things, you're going to continue to see them go after any and all software emulation of their modern systems, stuff like 3DS and Switch. And because Switch 2 is so based on Switch hardware with the Nvidia side of things, I'm pretty sure that it's going to be relatively easy, and I say that in quotation marks because it's definitely not going to be easy unless you're intelligent, to be able to get a Switch 2 emulator running some games relatively quickly after the launch. I think teams are going to be out there trying to stick it to Nintendo and kind of thumb their nose at them to show that they can do it. So Nintendo's argument about the legality of emulation is definitely going to go into 2025. They've got that new hardware out. They are getting beaten up by software emulation on the Nintendo Switch side of things, so they are always looking, and I think in 2025 you're going to continue to see at least Nintendo poke back at the software emulation makers. Obviously, Sega's not going to do anything. They're Sega and they never do stuff like that, and it seems like Microsoft and Sony really don't care either too much. Now, moving on to new innovations in old platforms, you also saw Yaba Sanshiro come out with a new build of Sega Saturn emulation after not having updated it for 2 years. And while this is definitely not the leading emulator when it comes to Sega Saturn, I would say that would be Mednafen. It is fun to see these retro consoles getting updated emulator builds. There's so many awesome platforms out there, and there's still some that don't have quote-unquote perfect emulation. I would say Sega Saturn is kind of leading the charge in emulation that does still need to be buttoned up a little bit. But it's so much fun to see people still working on this stuff. I mean, think of it this way. Think of a console, PlayStation 4 or before, that doesn't emulate whatsoever. I can't think of a single thing. Sure, Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 emulation are not perfect yet. They are still ongoing, but the fact that they work so well as they do is always impressive. But if you go back from PlayStation 3 or Xbox 360 into the PlayStation 2 and before era, literally every single piece of hardware out there has at least one emulator made for it, and you can go ahead and play a ton of games and just have fun. And that really is what software emulation is. It's removing the barriers between what you want to do when you play a game and the game in and of itself. Sometimes the setup can be a little bit cumbersome, but when you get it going, you just sit down and enjoy games. And Yaba Sanshiro updating showed that there is more innovation out there to be had in Sega Saturn emulation. And again, like I said, it is not perfect. Something like Saturn Bomberman, one of the best games on Saturn in my opinion, has some graphical glitches that wouldn't show up in Mednafen. But I do like seeing continued development on these retro consoles, and of course we also have the MiSTer FPGA core in active development, but this is about software emulation, so all I'm saying is it's great to have options when it comes to these retro gaming pieces of hardware. And of course we also have innovations on Nintendo 64 emulation, and DuckStation continues development doing more fun things. Now moving over to the Dreamcast, just recently I did a video on DCNat, which is a new way in Flycast to be able to play online games with basically no configuration whatsoever, no port forwarding, no dealing with your network's router settings, nothing like that whatsoever. And I think you're going to see more of this stuff in 2025, re-enabling more online support for more of people to be involved in, because again, trying to deal with the router settings on certain emulators can be absolutely mind-bendingly difficult, and you probably give up before you ever actually get to play online. So I think for a lot of the systems in 2025, you're going to see more of these streamlined approaches on how to make sure people can enjoy them and get the full functionality out of them without actually having to configure too much, because a lot of people are just going to download an emulator for nostalgia. They're going to think to themselves, I love Dreamcast back in the day, let me play it, but maybe they don't deal with all that much technology in their real lives, because I always have to remember when I talk about this stuff, what I know is not what you know, and what you know as a viewer of this channel is not what the general population knows. So something like DCNet, allowing people to get online easily, is going to be a huge deal in 2025. And even in 2024, we saw so many fun things, like the BSX Satellaview network being brought back by fans, and you actually being able to load up the game on an emulator and go into broadcast hours with a date and time, and basically get downloadable content for the Satellaview and Super Nintendo from emulation. I'd love to see something like this work on real hardware in 2025, but the fact that people were doing this last year really makes me think that you're going to be seeing a lot more of it in the future. And it really is, I feel like, the next frontier and next wave of emulation developments, because honestly, we've been able to run Super Nintendo in software emulation for decades now. If you think about it, Super Nintendo emulation is old enough to have gone to college, graduated, gotten his first job, bought a house, and had a kid with its spouse. That is really wild to think that we've been emulating Super Nintendo this long. I still remember like 2004 or so, being in an airport, going to a shoot out in Colorado and using my laptop to play Super Nintendo games, and it felt like magic back then, and seeing something like Satellaview come back in 2024 felt like that same magic all over again, where you have stuff like Rich Whitehouse's Big PMU, which is an Atari Jaguar emulator that might have the best front end of any emulator I've ever seen, and it's just doing so many wild things with a piece of hardware that definitely failed at market. Even now today, you can plug in something like a Quest 3 or any other VR headset into your PC, and you can play the one Atari Jaguar game that was supposed to have a VR headset in full virtual reality. That is the type of stuff that people definitely weren't asking for, probably didn't realize that they could do, but somebody goes out there and says to themselves, I'm going to make a brand new Atari Jaguar emulator, I'm going to give it a ton of new features and network options, and I'm even going to give it a VR mode for the one game that actually supports VR headsets. And that's why I think in 2025 you're going to see more of this stuff, new additions to retro gaming hardware and software emulation that just kind of allow you to do whatever it is you want, and I can't wait to see what happens. Leave me a comment down below and tell me what's the one thing more than anything else you'd love to see come to software emulation in 2025, and I'll definitely be doing a Shad PS4 video as soon as I get a little more footage of games that are running, as it is quite difficult to get content out of it. But that's kind of the video. I just wanted to say that I'm excited for emulation in 2025, and I'll definitely be doing a lot more videos on news updates. But we're done, I'll see you next time. Bye bye.